Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we got another solo album review, this time from McKinley Dixon for the album called For My Mama and Everyone Who Look Like Her. I don't think people talk about influence all that well, because it's not clear-cut. It becomes a messy conversation very fast, because on the one hand, you get the folks who put forward that since a certain act defined or influenced a scene, they must be held in top regard above everyone in that scene. After all, if it wasn't for them, the scene wouldn't exist. But influence doesn't always translate to success, commercial or critical, and vice versa. There are a lot of albums who get tons of critical acclaim or sell very well, but they don't wind up being influential on the scene longer term because might be difficult to recreate, or they don't have the staying power in the popular consciousness, or trends just change way too fast in the modern era and great moments wind up getting forgotten. It sucks, but it happens. And what I'm saying is that jazz rap tends to get screwed a lot in this department, and at this point we've got decades of evidence in order to support it. You can go back to the Diggable Planets or the Native Tongues Collective, who were building a lot of groundswell in the late 80s and early 90s and getting the acclaim for it, but then gangster rap rolled through instead. For a more recent example, when Kendrick Lamar put out To Pimp a Butterfly in 2015, it was all the talk of that year, and deservedly so, but then trap cemented its hold on mainstream rap, and the moment became just that, a moment, even for Kendrick. And this was kind of frustrating because, as a rule, and I include myself here, critics tend to really like the jazzier, more thoughtful side of hip-hop. It calls back to a potent sonic legacy, where there are still so many unique compositional avenues to be tapped. But again, I get why it's not really as popular. It's tougher to rap over, it's a little less accessible, and if you want the production to sound lush and organic and you pay for the live instrumentation, well, that calls back to your label and their budgets. But now I'd like to introduce McKinley Dixon, an artist out of Virginia who's been active the past 5 or so years, not just as a great forward-thinking rapper and poet, he's been getting some cosigns by underground veterans very quickly, but also gradually expanding his sound to pick up more jazzy timbres. But now he got signed to Space Bomb, the label I most well knew for Bedouin, Natalie Prass, and Laura Veirs. And given the critical buzz in certain circles that it was off the charts for this album, I really wanted to delve into it in detail, albeit considerably later than I would prefer. But what did we get with this? Alright, full disclosure, I wanted to cover this a month or so ago. I actually first found McKinley Dixon on Bandcamp. I found the critical acclaim by accident after I'd already listened to the album 3 or 4 times, and it took me a while to dig up the lyrics properly. That's why the solo review is as late as it is. But I also really wanted to cover it in a solo review because, no joke, this is some of the best music I have heard all year, not just in hip-hop. Definitely head and shoulders above the majority of rap I've heard in 2021, but McKinley Dixon has been conscious to avoid being pigeonholed in that genre, and I would argue this project doesn't really fit cleanly into it. Not only just dabbling in soul and R&B, but also a lot of jazz. And I'm not talking about the smooth and easy stuff. This was an album that floored me on first listen, and every chance I got, I went back for more, and yeah, I know, I'm late to covering it, but outside of that niche group of critics that this has been slept on so much, I want to fix that. This is special. And first off, McKinley Dixon might be one of the most impressive rappers purely on flow I have heard in years. The fact that the instrumentals lean more towards jazz make you think of Kendrick Lamar as a parallel, but the way that he bends and rolls around words and inflections, sounding ever so slightly off-kilter but always in control, it reminds me a lot of Andre 3000, maybe some traces of Quelle Chris or acid rap era Chance the Rapper in the vocal timbre and cadence. But you know what? Say what you will about a lot of them, a lot of their production had a lot more stability and a lot more consistent groove. And on a few tracks on this album, he gets some of it, but then you get tracks like Make a Poet Black, and finding a pocket in that production would be difficult for even the best of rappers. Then McKinley Dixon will find it multiple times and then change it up midway through with an elasticity that feels uncannily natural. But he's not just a pure spitter either who will rattle off bar after bar. He's a lot more free-flowing, borderline conversational, where there's a lot of wry, understated charm and charisma. Puts me more in the mind of No Name when she flows off beat or into odder territory. Or let me put it like this. I have heard enough rap where today it requires something really special for me to be a bit starstruck on flow alone, and McKinley Dixon got there with ease. And what's all the more thrilling is that he doesn't sacrifice a lot of song structure to do it. Unlike so many rappers who rely on pure wordplay, who can't assemble a coherent song at the end of the day, and given McKinley Dixon's rapping over some complex and freewheeling instrumentals that we would get to, he would have all the excuse not to just go for all the bars, but he also has hooks. He can structure a crescendo, a melodic flow, and that's not counting songs like Protective Styles, where he goes for more of an R&B or soul vibe, where he'll sing and he actually sounds pretty good. And this leads into a lot of the production, and where McKinley Dixon is able to showcase a certain amount of versatility that you might not expect, because while a lot of the compositional roots of this album, they are in jazz, and he's got the live horns, the bass, the guitar, the harp, and the drums across this album, which leads to a varied color, a variety in the sound that helps soften the blow of so many tight and tangled flows. It's not all just that. You get songs like Swangin', which has this fat, synth-inflected southern bounce, or Grown Man voice that shows a lot more of a parallel to vintage Tribe Called Quest. In fact, the final third of this album will slow down considerably with slightly more conventional rhythms, and it is a really good breather to allow McKinley Dixon to give his audience a little bit of breathing room, taking the more intimate moments. Really just exhale. We kind of needed it. And this is where I have to credit how he uses his guest verses, who can often flow at the same speed and remain thematically consistent. Honestly, the guest verses are uniformly great, but I was probably most impressed by both of Micah James's verses, but they also might not bring the same level of complexity or stylism in the wordplay to bear. And what that means is that while these songs remain dense, there's a little bit more variety in order to bracket the hooks. But still, this is where I can see some people maybe feeling a little intimidated by this album. It's less than 50 minutes long, but its density can make it feel a little longer than that, especially given how it starts close to full force, and where I don't really think the Kendrick comparison is all that apt anymore, given how Kendrick would prioritize the more accessible moments. McKinley Dixon has said maybe a closer point of inspiration is Kamasi Washington, and what he contributed on To Pimp a Butterfly in a lot of the production. But I'd argue the influence goes even further than that, and while Kamasi Washington makes some amazing music, bit of a learning curve to get into it, I'll say it. Now, part of this is how the album feels like it's throwing you straight into the deep end right from the start. Chain So Heavy can feel a bit like a clunky opener, especially with how you're met with the unstable groove, the double time flows, and the overlayered vocals by that second verse. And while things will stabilize a little bit more into the sharper rhythms and the blend of strings and horns on Never Will Know, the opening of this album will make it abundantly clear how on board you're going to be for this particular adventure. But you know, if you are on board, man alive, there's just so many stellar musical moments, when maybe the only thing I can criticize in the production being maybe some occasionally iffy vocal blending, and that's minor. I love how the strings build subtly behind Bless the Child, a precursor to how the coda will cycle through the utterly manic crescendos on Make a Poet Black. I love how Protective Styles is a very welcome breather that comes right after. A perfect, soulful, guitar-backed midpoint with some terrific bass work and strings, and there's just so much swagger on Brown's shoulders off that guitar line, the horns, and the vocal embellishments from Miss Jaylin Brown. But even as the album will slow a little bit more, we get the bass and the creaking warp of the strings bending off the thicker beat on BBNE, or the blast of horns midway through Grown Man Voice, or the beautiful interweaving harp and piano on Mama's House, and the melancholic saxophone drifting across the added vocals from Doe Eyes as the strings and the drums will slide back in for more of a communal moment on one of the few downbeat endings that I'll admit really do work for me. But coming back to that curve, now we get to the lyrics, and where given the layers, I can see how this album might seem difficult to parse, but not really at first. Indeed, for as blunt as some of the hooks and punchier lines can be, it seems like the themes materialize pretty damn quickly. How the black community can process grief and collective trauma, and McKinley Dixon is going to paint the scene in a way that's both visceral and, given where he's from, likely pretty transgressive. It also builds off the roots laid down from his first two projects, with Who Taught You to Hate Yourself examining black masculinity, and the importance of self-belief adding the feminine side to that equation. This project, it's kind of a sequel to both, and it necessarily builds off the emotional growth of those projects, but also more to add shades of complexity to his scenes and his poetry, to say nothing of the production. You can tell that a loss of a close friend from street violence is most on his mind, and with the deflective stoicism often expected of men, it's not helping, which can stretch through generations as described on Grown Man Voice. But the title of this album makes it very clear he's trying to look outside of himself for a more universal tale, peel through aged layers of trauma to find some sort of peace and solace. This ties into two metaphors that carry a lot of weight across the album, especially given their rather persistent ambiguity. The first being a little more conventional with the chain, representative of success, wealth, talent, however it's perceived, or maybe even status, but also every link to that system and that past that imbues it with weight, both on his soul and for everyone else who's desperately seeking it, or even just as a tie to family in the community that cannot be broken. But the metaphor I found a lot more striking was that of wings, for which he sees on all of his brethren in the streets, representative of the desperate hope, vitality, freedom they might have, but also shades of Icarus and the flimsy escapism of Peter Pan, and how said angels can be quick to be returned to God in our natural world. But this album's relationship with faith is considerably more confrontational than you would expect. Not just to religion, which he treats as a system of hectoring, ossified ritual that cannot effectively heal the soul or address the brutal reality of the streets and white supremacy, at least not now, but he even speaks about God, and that's kind of heavy. This is an album where the statement that God will provide will ring hollow in the face of lost brothers and broken systems, where everyone will claim their cause is just and righteous, where funeral rituals can't disguise those unjust losses, where goddamn, it's more than just an exclamation, where he wonders if Jesus and his crew were considered a gang to those who oppose their own radical and transformative ideas, where heaven might feel too close, and he doesn't want to go yet, where too much light can feel like an abyss, and hell might not wind up so bad after all. And all of that is placed in context with a lot of his own insecurities that are buried in a shallow grave at best. McKinley Dixon knows he's not the realist. He knows not everyone's going to be able to catch on that vibe. His success is not guaranteed. Unlike Kendrick, he's not looking to assume the responsibilities of leadership or the empowered father figure who can pull forth Excalibur because he's not sure he can. And while he knows his talent for rap could be a Lazarus pit of resurrection to get him out, that will create a new chain with the pendants for those who are sacrificed to do so. And that doesn't even touch on all the very vivid suicidal ideation all across this album, which you might expect from someone in the harrowing crossfire of the streets, especially when you feel like you're surrounded by all the angels to take you home. It would be so easy. More often than not, it kind of reminds me a little of Mike Mictian's closing lines on his verse of 38 Airweight on the All Hands album by Doomtree, featuring a lot of the same sort of aiming your gun at God, but that was a passing line on a survivalist album. On this project, it's a lot of text at the forefront. It's the natural outgrowth of collective trauma, where the crowns just feel increasingly heavy and hollow when they're stenciled on t-shirts, and the rituals of grief are just not enough. And yet, despite having a crisis of faith, that deep-seated anxiety that runs through so much of this album, it's not bleak or even hopeless. There's too much of a spirit here to run on nihilism, and that might be the roots off the most stirring parts of this project. If he's found a way out, he needs to be that figure for the kids, the community, his parents, his family. And you can tell he can't even pull himself to blame those who might kill or be killed in the streets. He knows the true roots of all this are a lot of broken white supremacist systems. Like Killer Mike on Thursday in the Danger Room on Run the Jewels 3, he can't find it in himself to blame those who are just trying to survive, even if they cause him pain to find their own angel's wings, which he also allows for himself. Again, he knows he's not all that innocent among them. It almost feels kind of cavalier in moments, how his own reckless pursuit of wings and chains can show and raise a question of how much he values his own life, especially alongside others. A very Spike Spiegel of him. But hell, even when it comes to faith, you can tell he wants to believe. He never wanted to feel bigger than God, he just wanted to outrun his own death. cherish the moments he feels alive, and along the way be there for his friends and family however he can. And by the end of the album, that stoic veneer breaks apart completely, and he has to confront the pointlessness of the death and the added painful burdens that are coming with survival, especially when one death can tear and sever through a family tree through its cascade of consequences. But you can also tell he has done some of the work in order to process that trauma. The song actually veers the line between sardonic and weary earnestness, like most of the nuggets of humor on this album, because there actually is some. But a song like Protective Styles, it's a mantra of how they need therapy. It's plain. And the line that really jumped out at me came on Brown's Shoulders, where he references how to turn money up into feelings, an inversion of what you normally see from rap, but highlighting how that security can at least give you the space to take a breath and process your life and your emotions. And even here, this is not an album that disbelieves in rituals, because at least with family, it can provide some solace. Linked predominantly to black hair, which he still gets cut within his family, seeing his lineage going both backwards and forwards. And even if the light exposes his blemishes, beneath those blemishes, he's got a light of his own. It's a feedback loop of how that survival and healing isn't just for them, but for him as well, providing that they have the time, and he wants that time. And look, this is the sort of project that will throw a lot of listeners who aren't prepared for it. Once you get a handle on the flows, the off-kilter moments, you've got to untangle the poetry, which could be viewed on a metatextual level as another defense mechanism thrown up in order to deflect from the very real trauma that is gradually peeled back. You get through those layers. But as I said, you can feel and pick up on that heaviness very early, and it rarely subsides. But while there is a lot of complicated emotionality on display, it doesn't overwhelm you so much as it might reveal. For as much as you put into this album, you're gonna get so much more out, because it's virtuoso talent across the board, but also a lot of real honest humility that lends it a real populism that made me want to keep listening. Even though the flows are fast, you can make out what he's saying. And on a level of pure technical craftsmanship, goddamn indeed. I'm not sure it's been paralleled this year. 9 out of 10. If you're a fan of rap, jazz, or just goddamn great music, you owe it to yourself to hear it. What a find. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you would like and subscribe, I'd be very grateful. I truly hope I got this one right in the case that the artist actually hears it. I tried to put an effort to try to untangle all the layers to this, because this is a layered and complicated album, but yeah, you'll want to hear it. Again, I've not heard hip-hop that's better than this year. It is something special. If you want to have any comments beyond that, please leave them down there below. Anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process so I can cover more albums, link to my Patreon right over there. Please don't feel obligated. It's tough times out there for everyone. I understand, but options available. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.